Good evening. I am Michelle Kidwell Gilbert, Chair of the Archaeology Committee of the National Arts Club, and delighted to welcome our audience to Philistines at Ashkelon, New Insights from the Leon Levy Expedition, given by Dr. Daniel M. Master, Professor of Archaeology at Wheaton College, Illinois. It's especially wonderful conversing with wide attendees, going around and welcoming everyone. It's quite extraordinary after this hiatus to have such a full room. I thank everyone for being here, and may I remind you that masks must be worn throughout the Arts Club. I thank you for that. I will be putting mine back on. The Leon Levy Foundation, established in 2004, has granted over $400 million to diverse endeavors devoted to, in alphabetical order, the ancient world, arts and humanities, human rights, Jewish culture, nature and gardens, as well as neuroscience research. A rather impressive agenda from a foundation which has also supported exploration and research into Philistine Ashkelon for 35 years. I next request that Emily Master stand. Emily? And no, this is not because she happens to be Daniel's wife, but in her own right. Emily is the Executive Director of the Friends of the Israel Antiquities Authority, the preeminent professional organization in the field of Israeli and biblical archaeology. The authority supports significant excavations at Canaanite, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim sites, amongst others. For understanding the surrounding context and dynamic world from which the Philistines emerged, contemplate with me a time period lasting a few thousand years, replete with massive destruction, accompanied by disrupted migration of peoples. The volcanic eruption on Thera, today Santorini, wreaking havoc in Crete and to the Minoan Empire. The Mycenaean forces invading and subduing Crete. The exodus of Israelites fleeing Egypt. The Trojan Wars, devastating portions of Asia Minor and leading Prince Aeneas to travel to Italy by way of Carthage. The marauding sea peoples, engendering palpable dislocations in the eastern Mediterranean. And then the Dorian invasions of Mycenaean Hellas, ushering in the Greek Dark Ages. Kindly recall that the invitation to tonight's lecture states that the Philistines were of Cretan origin, purveyors of a significant cultural heritage. Biblically speaking, a number of locations, including but not limited to Cush, Punt, Canaan, Caperin or Captor, which is probably Crete, are associated with the Philistines' place of origin. I look forward to learning from tonight's eminent speaker what might be correct, and we're assuming in advance that it's Crete. This is our second lecture devoted to the Philistines. The first, in 2011, was given by Archaeology Committee member Dr. Robert B. Cole, Emeritus Professor of Archaeology, Hunter College. Currently in Crete, he sends his regards to Professor Master, scholar to scholar. Professor Daniel M. Master graduated from Cairn University in 1992 and from Miami University in 1995, receiving his doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University in 2001. An archaeologist with international stature, focusing upon Ashkelon for 25 years, Daniel Master co-directed the Leon Levy Expedition to Ashkelon, a city located within the Levant. The seaport at this major ancient Philistine site played a critical role in maritime trade routes, somewhat analogous to Komos in Crete, which Professor James Wright treated a year ago, January. Interestingly, I came across, and this is a quote, Excavators and Excavations permit for year 2016 from the Israel Antiquity Authority, which read, Excavations at Ashkelon with a Q, G30, Lawrence E. Sager on behalf of Harvard University, the Semitic Museum, and then a number sign, Daniel M. Master on behalf of Harvard University, the Semitic Museum. Within the last few years, the Leon Levy Expedition concluded its excavations at Ashkelon. This has allowed Daniel to continue publishing significant discoveries for many seasons spent digging, most recently completing Ashkelon 7, the Iron Age 1, a volume devoted to the early Philistines. But don't think this is Daniel's only endeavor, for in addition to teaching 2016, he began working as co-director of Wheaton College's Tel Sharon Excavations in Israel, an initiative in partnership with Tel Aviv University, sponsored by the Museum of the Bible. In 2020, he participated in a 4-day virtual conference at New York University, the land that I will show you, which I personally viewed. On October 27th, he excellently discussed the fate of New Canaan in a panel entitled Between Old and New Canaan. I now invite Professor Master to address our audience so we all will become more enlightened about this evening's fascinating subject. Daniel?
Thank you, Michelle, for that very kind introduction and for getting us started thinking about the Philistines. I've had an interest in the Philistines for a long time, and I've been interested in them because they sort of seem to be a self-contained group in a way. They were around for 600 years. We can talk about their beginning, their middle, their end, and they're an interesting group for thinking about what makes up a group of people. How do we define ourselves and identify ourselves? And so one of the things that this lecture is designed to do is to answer this question of who are the Philistines. My wife is giving me heavy signals. What are you trying to do? Lift up the microphone. Now can you hear me better? Okay. Now I seem to be booming to myself, but I guess now we can all hear me well. Before I get started talking about Ashkelon and the Philistines and this question of who were the Philistines and how do we define an ancient group, how do we identify them, what are their characteristics, I do need to give some thanks. And I want to thank the 4 people who are on the screen right now, 4 individuals who really are responsible for the excavations at Ashkelon, thinking it through, having the ambition, having the foresight in order to put these things together. You can't see all of them clearly. This was the best picture I could find with the 4 of them in a row. But on the left-hand side with his arms crossed is Professor Philip King of Boston College, a wonderful scholar who is really one of the key people in sort of putting together the project that was Ashkelon. He's immediately next to him is Leon Levy, who's slightly obscured in this particular image. Right next to him is Shelby White. They had the vision to think about a project that would be a long-term project covering thousands of years that would really make a difference in the study of the Eastern Mediterranean. And on the right-hand side is my mentor, Lawrence Stager, who is the founder of the Ascarion Excavations project and really was the intellectual force behind putting it together. And together these 4 people envisioned, back in 1985, a major excavation that would last decades, that would make a contribution. And I stand on their shoulders in every respect. And so many of the things that I'm going to say here are really, I hope, the outworking of the vision that they originally had for what we could do at a site like Ashkelon. Who are the Philistines? When we think about the Philistines, really there's been no one who couldn't answer that question sort of in Western civilization for the last 1,000 years. It's not like the Philistines were ever lost. And so when we think about the Philistines, we can think of highlights here of our sort of common heritage here as we think of Caravaggio and him as he's trying to understand David and Goliath. Who doesn't know the story of David and Goliath? In what culture, part of Western culture, is it not sort of an identifiable trope that we use all the time for trying to understand the world in which we live? And so the Philistines were sort of defined as that group of overbearing oppressors who, in that unlikely event, could be thrown off, whatever the oppressor was. Or again, we can think of other classics here from the National Gallery, this painting attributed to Rubens, which we have the other major Philistine identifiable story, the story of Samson and Delilah. Again, once again, we all know the story, or we know something about the story. Perhaps we don't know anything about the story except those names, and we sort of envision it as the painter did here, sort of the femme fatale with the strong man on her lap. This story of the Philistines is one that we've always known. We've always sort of thought we knew who the Philistines were. I can look at this image, which sort of brings to mind another Philistine development, which is the idea in the 18th and the 19th and into the 20th century that the Philistines and Goliath and all of those stories were the enemy of everything that was sort of higher culture, the enemy of everything that was sophisticated, the enemy of everything that was, well, let's just say they're the people who don't come to the National Arts Club, is the idea that we have in our society today. And that's sort of an overwhelming motif when it comes to the Philistines, and it's something that was developed through time. The Oxford intellectual Matthew Arnold in the middle of the 19th century talked about the middle class as Philistines. And he had one long comment where he said, the United States or America is entirely made up of Philistines, right? And this was his idea that people were unenlightened or uncultured, as he tried to put it together. And certainly that idea is there, but I think it goes without saying to some extent that none of these ideas really have anything to do with the ancient Philistines. They're all sort of an idea that they're the other, that they're the group that we don't like, and so we sort of make them the embodiment of the things that we don't like in our world, and we can see that shifting through the eras. The story of the Philistines as an ancient group really started, one has to say, at the very end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, when we have the story of Napoleon's ill-fated trip to Egypt. And as he goes and accomplishes little politically or militarily, he does bring back the Rosetta Stone. And so in bringing back the Rosetta Stone, which soon finds its way to the British Museum, we have the great breakthrough that sort of is going to introduce us to much of the ancient world with the decipherment of hieroglyphics. And so with the decipherment of hieroglyphics, these Egyptian monuments that previously had just been the subject of speculation now began to yield their secrets. And I have here a temple from Luxor. This is the temple of Madinat Habu. This is a temple from the 12th century B.C., and it's a critical one because it's the temple of the early 20th dynasty pharaoh Ramses III. And Ramses III had an encounter with a group of people who no one had ever seen before. I put up here a translation, a much more recent translation by Donald Redford, of some of the texts from Madinat Habu. And I want to just point out a couple ideas that were noticed very early, even in the 19th century. Champollion himself, who deciphered hieroglyphics, is held responsible for that, noticed right away some of the things from these texts. The idea that there was some sort of a conspiracy, it's often translated, in the islands. And a group of people came out from some way and marauded across the Mediterranean, is how it's styled here, touching all these parts of the Mediterranean, these different places that they seem to have attacked, setting up a camp in Amuru, and then coming on to attack Egypt. And in discussing who these groups of people were, right away, Champollion settled on, noticed right away, this group called the Peliset, which you'll see in about the fifth line up from the bottom. The Peliset, and immediately he wanted to argue, and did argue that, and people who followed him picked up on this idea, that this was the Philistines, and this was the first mention of the Philistines. And the fact that here we are in the 12th century BC, and it's the first time the Philistines appear in Egyptian text, something that's still true today, was an important chronological datum because all of a sudden it gave us a beginning of the arrival of the Philistines in the region, the first time they appear on the Egyptian radar screen. If we were to sort of try to plot out what the Egyptians are saying happened, or at least how this was understood, we have the idea of a people coming from, here I have generally islands, I've picked out some of the places that they're said to have marauded through, and then the idea is that perhaps they came down to Egypt. Now, much of this is disputed in terms of the way in which people might reconstruct this, but it's hard to overestimate how dramatic a breakthrough this was for the study of the ancient world, the study of the Philistines. For the first time, they're appearing on the scene from a contemporary standpoint. In addition, we have pictures of them, finally. And so from the walls of Madinat and Habu, we can identify that some of the groups that the Pharaoh is attacking and is capturing as prisoners must certainly belong to this group, the Peliset, or the Philistines, and they seem to engage in a land battle against the Egyptians, which the Egyptians, of course, say that they lost, and they engage in some kind of a sea battle against the Philistines as well, and some similar depictions across this temple at Madinat Habu. So this idea of the Philistines, a picture of them, the idea that they came in the 12th century, that they attacked Egypt, all of these things were breakthroughs in the study of who are the Philistines. In the 19th century already, people quickly thought about that idea of the 12th century and all the things that were happening in the 12th century. And the other thing that the Philistines were connected to, in addition to the Hebrew Bible, the other texts that people had in their mind so prominently were the texts, of course, of Homer. And so as people were thinking about retrojecting those stories in this discussion as well, they thought about trying to connect the stories of Homer and the Trojan War and sort of the activities that took place after that with this study, with this new group, the Philistines, who seemed more or less to fit chronologically into that general world. I have here on the right-hand side the legend of Mopsis. Mopsis is a seer who is supposed in Greek, in these sort of Greek mythic histories, to have taken a band of survivors from the Trojan War down to Cilicia, and then, according to some later classical renditions that we have around Ashkelon, to take the group all the way down here, down the coast. And again, the matching of those two events was something that was picked up in the 19th century quite controversially. So we have Duroger here, who coins the term the Sea Peoples. He wants to describe this group of people, and he says people of the sea is how they should be described, these sea peoples, and he wants to connect them to the stories of the Trojan War and the maraudings that took place after that. It's something that people are quite skeptical of, but the work of Schliemann at Troy and some of the currents in archaeology give this life and have people continuing to think about this question of who are the Philistines, and the answer here in the 19th century is they're the sea peoples. As the 20th century begins, as we sort of are moving forward, as the 20th century begins, it's now the turn of the archaeologists to try to enter into this discussion. Because now the archaeologists have the wherewithal to be able to understand ancient tell sites and to be able to sort of put some of these ideas together. And they now know also when to look. We'd already known where to look because in the biblical text, they'd already described cities of the Philistines. And so more or less, as I draw this here, this is the area of the Philistines. There are 5 cities that are mentioned: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath. And these 5 cities are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the Philistine cities. And so roughly in this area, the archaeologists knew to look. And so as they started to look, not even in these cities themselves, in places like Bet Shemesh and Gezer, they immediately started to find in the 12th and 11th century, so roughly in that chronological ballpark, they started to find decorated pottery that reminded them of things that they had seen farther to the west in the central Mediterranean, that reminded them of things they had seen in the Aegean. So that connection of pottery styles, this new pottery that was appearing, and the fact that it was similar to the pottery that they knew from other places was the kind of thing that jogged their memory, that sort of made them think, I wonder if what we're seeing here is an archaeological reflex of the coming of the Philistines to this particular region. I've just picked 2 vessels here because I think with these 2 vessels, even though they're not the ones that were talked about in the early 20th century, you can see the shape similarities for sure between these different vessels. And there are also some other stylistic vessels. The one on the top is from Ashkelon, and the other was the famous Mycenaean warrior crater from the National Museum in Athens. But just to show you the general gist of the idea. And here in the early 20th century, this is as close as they got. This was as advanced as it was in terms of putting together this idea that we might be seeing the Philistines in the 12th and the 11th century. But we go on because what this triggered was a much more thoroughgoing, much more advanced attempt to understand who the Philistines are, who the Philistines were. through excavations in here, the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, of 4 of the 5 Philistine sites. Now, all of these sites sort of provide unique insights into who the Philistines are. Obviously, since my work is primarily at Ashkelon, I'm going to focus on the results of the Leon Levy Expedition to Ashkelon. I may refer to some other things in passing, but many of these sites also tell a similar story, so it's not by telling the Ashkelon story, I'm not leaving out too much as we're trying to understand this question of who the Philistines are. So now, with the more advanced technology of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, archaeologists went to try to look at this question. Can we, by looking at the material remains left behind in times like the 12th and 11th century, understand who the Philistines were and get a better sense for how they lived their lives? I'll show you some results that are typical of all of the Philistine sites that help to try to get a sense for this particular question. We start with pottery. Initially, I just showed you some similarities in shape, some rough similarities in shape, but due to the work at Ashkelon and Ekron and Ashdod, we can now talk about these stylistic similarities between the places that we're talking about in the southern Levant, the Philistine cities, and Cyprus and the Aegean in a much more nuanced way. In 2018, Penelope Mountjoy wrote an epic work on Philistine pottery and Cypriot pottery in which she outlined in extreme detail, a very careful detail, a lot of the similarities that are more than just shape and rough similarity, but now we're down to very precise details about the decoration that you find on the earliest Philistine pottery. This is pottery roughly dated by Mountjoy and others to around 1175 to 1150, give or take. And so here we have, in this particular slide, just a motif. You can see it's the antithetic spiral flanking lozenge, and you see that we have examples from Ashkelon, from Ekron, from Ashdod, and also from Cyprus. And as you look at the motif, you can see that these are not independent inventions, right? They're talking about some sort of community that's having some relationship to one another, that's being able to draw the same things, make the same kinds of designs on their pottery. Other kinds of detailed, nuanced similarities between the artistic hand of these different potters located in different places. And here it's not so much the motif that I wanted you to notice, but it's also the fact that we have it in Philistia, in Cyprus, in Tarsus, and the Greek islands. Right? We have these same motifs spread across a wide array of places, and all dated more or less here to the early 12th century. And so we have this sort of field of communication within the world of pottery that's linking all of these places together. I'll show you another version of this piece from Ashkelon, but I'm just noticing this bird. You can see the bird here and here and here, linking now Philistia and Cyprus and Crete. And so we have these very distinct, very detailed motifs that are found in the pottery, widely separated, pottery that's all made by local potters out of local clays. This isn't the trade of objects. And we have these objects having very detailed similarities that show this way in which these groups are in some way related to one another. So pottery is one of the areas still that people work on as they try to understand the nature of these relationships. I'll show you another idea that came from Ashkelon but has now been found all over the eastern Mediterranean. There's some rather uninspiring clay cylinders in the upper left-hand corner here. These are unfired clay cylinders, and you might sort of walk past them. They really aren't decorated in any way. And when these were first discovered, people didn't know what they were. They thought they might be some sort of a weight that was of a similar size, but they're just kind of unfired clay lumps. In our work at Ashkelon, one of the things that we did is we tried to be very careful not only with the finding of objects, but understanding the context in detail. And so these objects come from a context that's in the picture next to it. Here they are in a row on a floor. And one of the things we were able to do was to sample this floor. And as we sampled the floor and looked for the micro remains that were spread across the floor, fish scales, microdebitage, other very small seeds and things, what we found was a concentration of cloth and textile fibers, more or less corresponding to the specific location of these particular weights. And so we had the weights in a row up against the side of a room. We had in that very space evidence of textile making, and so it seemed likely to us, and now an idea that has been entirely accepted across the Mediterranean, that these were weights to hold down the vertical fibers of a loom. And so the idea was that these were loom weights. And these loom weights have been found, again, across the Mediterranean, from the Aegean all the way through Cyprus, all the way down to Philistia. And they're another way in which we're seeing not just the style of pottery, but industrial technology. The way in which they were making some of these basic things are similar across this range of groups of people. And so it was another way in which we could start to look at similar technology and industry during this time. I show these two pictures. On the left hand is a cooking pot from the 12th and 11th century in Ashkelon, and on the right hand is a square hearth. Now, these are the ways in which our early Philistines are cooking. What's interesting to us is the fact that it's not the way that people around them were cooking beforehand or during the same time outside Philistia. They would normally use beehive-shaped ovens and large open cooking pots. And when this group of people come, these Philistines, I'm going to argue, they bring with them their own way of cooking and making meals, and even a similar and different vocabulary for who eats together and how many people are fed at once. All those kinds of things, which you probably know from your own experience, are often indicative of belonging to one culture or another. Perhaps you have different sets of dishes at home for serving different kinds of cuisines, and so it seems that we're seeing these different ways culturally of eating in the family. And this idea, as archaeologists were trying to think about it, they were trying to think, are there things, more than just pottery or more than just style, that are indicative of sort of the heart of a people, of the core of who a group of people is? And people thought, well, yeah, that idea of hearth and home, that idea of how we eat together might be just one of those things that we can use to try to get a sense of who the Philistines are. Here's another example. This is reconstruction of a Philistine house from Ashkelon. And this reconstruction of the Philistine house gives us a nice snapshot of what life was like in those houses. But on the left-hand side is a rather more technical graph, basically trying to show how the houses were made in terms of how people progressed through the space, how private were rooms, how public were rooms. And one of the things that people noticed as they looked at Ashkelon and Ashdod and Ekron was that there was a different architectural vocabulary. There was a different way of organizing family space in these houses that was dissimilar from the world around them, but similar to the world of the Aegean in a lot of respects. This is something that can't move. You have to have people who know this, or you have to have families that want this, and it showed a different cultural world. I show you two enigmatic inscriptions here. There are very, very few bits of early writing from Philistia. These are there aren't very many more examples of early writing from this area of Philistia in the 12th and 11th century. Neither of them are readable. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion about what the script is that they're written in. So on the left-hand side is an ostrakon, that's red ink on a piece of pottery, and on the right-hand side is a seal. And these were evaluated on the left by Frank Moore-Cross and on the right by Pikal McCarter. And both of them came to the conclusion after much study that these did not represent the classic alphabet of the region in any form, that they really looked much more like scripts that you find farther to the west in places like Cyprus and even farther. What we're dealing with is a group of people who are writing, it seems, in a different language. I showed you this image before. I showed you the bird when we were talking about the pottery. Now I want to show you something else. What I want to show you is how they make self-portraits. We're trying to get at their essence. Are they really a different group of people? How are they described? And so one of the things people noticed that we have these two heads right here, one there and one here, and you'll notice sort of the architectural idea here that you picture the head from the side. You have an eye that's right in the middle of the head. You have the hair coming sort of wildly off the top of the head, as Lawrence Steger used to describe it as the punk hairstyle of the Philistines. And the thing about this is that it's not how the Egyptians draw people, and it's not what we see in other contexts, but it is how you draw people, and we see them drawn on pottery that's from farther to the west, from the world of the Aegean. And so even that idea of how I draw myself, this idea of a self-portrait, seemed to have pointers that pushed us to the west and forced us to look at what was going on there. So this was what was going on in terms of the progress of archaeology in the late 20th century and into the early 21st century. As they were looking at the sites in this region, they were noticing the sites were different from sites that had been there previously and different from the world that was immediately surrounding them, and they were much more like sites in Cyprus and sites in the general region of the Aegean. And so while there was controversy about whether perhaps the Philistines came from Cyprus or came from the Aegean, there was a general agreement that what you were seeing was a whole bunch of new cultural traits that were widespread and really spanned sort of the range of cultural expressions that pointed to something foreign, that pointed to something different in terms of how this region was developing in the 12th and the 11th century BC. I put this slide in here because I think it's a nice sort of summative slide for thinking about what this archaeological work accomplished. This is a 1992 article from the New York Times, and it has the title, "Philistines Were Cultured After All, Say Archaeologists," right? And so the idea that they're playing with that 19th and 20th century idea of the Philistines as uncultured. But then what they're trying to do, as they discuss Ashkelon in this particular article, is to talk about the Philistines and their connections back to the Aegean. You'll notice that the icon they've used here in the middle of the article is from Madinat Habu. So they're really combining some of that work from the Egyptian depictions, the work at Ashkelon. One thing is building on the other in order to give us this picture of what the Philistines were really like, as opposed to what we think they might be like. On the right-hand side, I've pictured sort of three of the people who are so fundamental in much of this research. The Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar, the biblical scholar in the center, Frank Moore-Cross, and then Larry Steger on the right-hand side, who are putting together this synthesis and arguing for the migration of this group of people from the Mycenaean world, was the idea from the area of the Aegean here during this period. So you might think that it's solved. Who are the Philistines? They're perhaps from the Mycenaean world. They come in the 12th and 11th century and bring all these new cultural ideas. But it really isn't so, because as we look at how scholars in the broader community responded to the presentation that I've just given, they had two major concerns, two major issues that they were worried about as it relates to the Philistines that left them skeptical about this particular reconstruction. The first point of skepticism was an archaeological one. And the archaeological point of skepticism was to say all of these cultural features are nice, but ultimately they're indirect. We all know that we couldn't be you couldn't figure out our identity by figuring out where the clothes we're wearing were made, right? That wouldn't work. You couldn't necessarily figure out identity by looking at our favorite foods. Maybe, maybe not. We understand how we, certainly in our modern era, pick up ideas from all around us. Stylistic ideas, culinary ideas, architectural ideas. And so the archaeological response to this was, you haven't fully made the case. You're arguing that a group of people moved when it could have just been ideas that moved. We could be dealing with a new era in which new ideas are sweeping across the Mediterranean rather than new people. The second point of skepticism that they had was that there was a connection between what was happening here in the 12th and 11th century and the stories about the Philistines in the Bible. The issue here is that the stories of Samson and Delilah or the stories of David and Goliath are written down much, much later, in the middle of the first millennium BC. And so you have these stories that are compiled at the very least, even if there's earlier sources that they're using, they're compiled in the middle of the first millennium, some 500 years, 400 years later than the events that they're describing. And so the other point of skepticism was to say, yes, you're describing some phenomenon that's interesting here, but why are you connecting it to the Philistines of the Bible? It's not clear to me that these things go together. It's not clear to us that you could remember something for 600 years, that you could really have that as a concept that would last through all of that time. And so you can see from the dates, 2015, 2017, when these two articles were written, that you have this ongoing skepticism, which was something that we wanted to see if there were new ways to address as we were working at Ashkelon and wrapping up our work there. I was approached in 2013, actually 2012, I believe it was, by this fellow, Shlomo Pufano, when I was finishing my excavation one day. And he came by and he said to me, I know where the Philistines were buried, which was interesting to me. I'd been working at the site then for 20 years. I didn't know where the Philistines were buried. But he said, I used to be an inspector for the Department of Antiquities at that time, and I was asked to prepare the way for possible municipal playground. And so they asked me to go to this area just north of the ancient city and to do some probing. And when I did this probing, every time I went down 60 centimeters, I found a Philistine burial. And if you follow me and go down 60 centimeters, you too can find a Philistine burial. Okay, I can't turn the ship quite that quickly, but by the next year, we had set up a program where we were going to go try to repeat his experiment and see if we could find a cemetery of the Philistines. And so we went out with him to the area that he suggested, and we started to dig probes all over the place. And instead of going down 60 centimeters, we were going down 2 meters. Or 3 meters. We were going down an enormous distance trying to find something, and we were finding exactly nothing. Not even pieces of pottery, just nothing at all. It was sterile sand. It looked like it was completely outside the site. There was nothing to find. And I think that Shlomo himself was doubting his own sanity, because he would be with us and he'd be standing and say, this is where I found this. And we would dig there and we would find nothing. And so we dug and dug, probe after probe, and we sent people out for one day and then for a second day, and we found absolutely nothing. In the second day, the person who was running the survey was Dr. Adam Aja of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. And I think that he was so sick of the project that he decided to continue to dig in a hole way past 3 meters. I'm just going to see how deep I can go, because I don't know if we're going to find anything anyways. And so as he started to dig way below 3 meters, all of a sudden the soil changed, which was interesting. And then when the soil changed, he started to find bits and pieces of something. And so he saw these bits and pieces, and he sort of sent it up to me. I've got something. And I saw there were bits of bone and bits of pottery, but they weren't identifiable. I took it back to our specialist who deals with animal bones. And I held out my hand to her, and I said, can you identify this? And she, from a distance, said, that's not mine, get it away from me, because she doesn't deal with human bones. And so immediately she recognized, you've just come across something that's different than my experience, and we need to handle this in a slightly different way. But what we knew is that somehow, even though it was very different than we expected, we had come down on the cemetery of the Philistines. That last day, we were able to find evidence that allowed us to go back and open up the area much more widely and understand what was going on there. Let me explain what did happen. What happened was between the let's say the early 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, when Shlomo had been doing his work, and today, someone had the idea of making a parking lot in the space, and so they brought in 3 meters of sterile soil to dump over the entire area. Right? Like a big blanket over the entire space. And so what we have is this big layer of brown silt and sand, which we had to take away when we were excavating, that was from the last 30 years. And once we found that was removed, it was exactly as Shlomo had suggested that it would be. We had an area that was probably preserved because it was under a Roman vineyard. I show you these Roman pits across the screen, and if I were to map them out, you can see that they're in rows. And so the distance apart probably is the size of a vineyard. And so we have these Roman pits that are, and then below the Roman pits, protected underneath it, is a series of cists that belong to a cemetery of the Philistines. And this is the world that we wanted to try to understand. It was kind of a mess. So I will explain what's going on with the cemetery of the Philistines and then how this generated a project that could really move forward our study of the Philistines at Ashkelon. So it was a relatively large cemetery. We had over 250 individuals who were buried in this particular space. We could have excavated thousands if one had had time. It was a very large cemetery. We were able to find men and women together in more or less equal numbers. This was a cemetery primarily of adults. We did not find the number of children we would expect for an ancient mortality pattern. So there's a selection here. Most of the people were adults in this cemetery. And the question I get asked the most, as you can kind of imagine, is how tall were they? Why they asked that, I don't know. But anyways, how tall were they? The tallest person we had was 5'5". So not very is the answer to the question as we're looking at it. As we look at this, though, let me show you what this was like and how they built this cemetery, because here's our open plot of land, and we're going to start to put in some inhumations here and start to bury some people. And maybe in some cases there's space, maybe not. We can't, this person who's just been buried across, they didn't know the person below was there. They're not marked necessarily. So one might be cut over or cut into another one. And so you can sort of see the way in which this is building up over time in order to make a very compact and full area. So putting that together, we have a huge amount of individuals, one on top of the other, that we had to try to disentangle to get a better sense of what was going on with these Philistines. I was working on this with Dr. Adam Aja on the left and Dr. Sherry Fox in the middle, who's our physical anthropologist, and we were trying to sort of pull apart some very detailed items here. What we're working on in this particular image are two people superimposed one on the other. You're actually looking at two individuals, not one, and we're trying to sort of pull it apart very carefully and understand this very delicate archaeological context. What we had is a cemetery that was from the 10th and the 9th century. Now, we've been talking a lot about the 12th and the 11th century, the early Philistines. This cemetery was from the 10th and the 9th century, and we had carbon-14 dates that helped us to basically say, this is the time in which the cemetery is in action, and that is the 10th and the 9th century B.C. There were some people who were, I don't know, call them outliers, but we had instances like this person here who was probably also from the 10th or the 9th century B.C., but because they ate so much fish, it made their radiocarbon date look much older. It turns out that fish who live in the sea have a different way of interacting with the carbon in the atmosphere such that they look hundreds of years older than people who are just eating the plants. And so if someone eats a lot of fish, they can look older. Maybe I think normally I eat fish to look younger, but that's what it is in carbon-14 terms. Nevertheless, we had a 10th and 9th century cemetery here in which we were looking at sort of the development of the Philistines. And I want to think about that idea of the development of the Philistines because it's going to be important as we try to understand who they were. Here's a classic example of a burial of the Philistines, and you can see a single person laid out on their back and accompanied often by these storage jars, bowls, and juglets. I picked this particular image. Dave Miklos is here, just got back from Rome yesterday, so thank you for coming. If you want to see this particular burial, you can see it in New York. It's the only place that it is, because just this last fall, Cold Spring Harbor, in association with City College of New York, created a DNA learning center in Brooklyn, so just not that far from here. And in making this DNA learning center in Brooklyn, they decided to take this individual who we had carefully surveyed and made a complete 3D model of. They decided to print that 3D model at 1:1. And so you can see a beautiful, perfect representation of this over there at the DNA Learning Center. And so I urge you, when that opens up more broadly, and we're sort of in our post-COVID days, to go visit there and to see the way in which they're using this in order to educate students from Brooklyn about the DNA and how we can prepare and understand it for better understanding our common future. In any case, this is what our Philistine burials tend to look like, with these pottery vessels near the feet. Sometimes they take perfume vessels and they put it near the chest or near the face or near the head in some way, perhaps as a way of keeping the smell down, both for the person who's being buried and for the people who are doing the burying. These are small little perfume juglets. These juglets are imported. We're now looking at pottery that is typical of the Eastern Mediterranean and not distinctively Philistine, as we were talking about before. None of those distinctive patterns. Now, all of a sudden, the pottery of the Philistines kind of looks like everybody else. There really isn't much that you could point to and say, this looks like it was Greek, or this looks like it comes from the Western Mediterranean, or the Central Mediterranean. What we have is typical Levantine pottery here in the 10th and the 9th century. This is interesting because the scholars who are working at the nearby site of Philistine Gath also tell us that by this point, all the inscriptions that they're finding of the Philistines are also found in a classic script of the local script, and they're writing, when we look at the grammar, we look at those types of things they're putting together, we're going to see that they're writing in a Semitic language. They're not distinctive in any particular way as we're looking at this, or certainly not in any way like they were before. So an interesting pattern here in terms of what we're seeing. There's some interesting particular individuals. This is a woman who was decked out in her jewelry when she was buried. We have bracelets on the wrists. We have earrings going all the way up the ear on both sides. And we even have a bracelet that is on the right arm of this individual, which I have sort of highlighted. It's right here, and it's right here, and it's right here. We were able to even see the stringing order of some of these bracelets, which is very rare when you're usually finding loose beads. But to see how they put it together into a piece of jewelry was sort of interesting to us as we saw this particular individual. I'll show you this one. This is a series of 4 individuals, one on top of each other. The bottom individual is on the bottom, and the sort of the top pile is on the top. I thought when we first found this that we had found something interesting, because at the hip of the individual we have a quiver of arrows. We had weapons in this. So we were thinking perhaps this was a burial of some sort of a warrior, perhaps there's some sort of significance there in terms of what's going on. I was just working on the catalog for the final publication of this, and I learned 2 horrific things. The first is that, they're not both horrific. One's just interesting, the other's horrific. The first is that what we had here wasn't a warrior at all, that of the individuals here, several of them had weapon marks from these weapons on their body, right? So rather than looking at a heroic warrior burial, we're looking at the scene of the crime, right? And then I also learned that 3 of the 4, perhaps 4 of the 4, are women, right? So all of a sudden we've gone from one thing to something very different, right? And we're seeing in the Philistine world all the kinds of things that are coming up. When we look at this population, it is not always a positive situation. We find the stresses that they have. We find the fractures that they had. We find the childhood traumas that they have. And here sometimes we even find, as it were, the scene of the crime. There were some children that were in this particular cemetery. They often were covered with a blanket of sherds here. They were treated in a slightly different way, as if they were being treated specially. This was an interesting phenomenon we found as well. Sometimes we had cremations as we were looking at these inside large jars. These are some of the stylistic things we're seeing, but nothing here is distinct from what you'd find if you were digging a cemetery in Lebanon. Right? You're not finding too many things that are too distinct or too strange, or that are uniquely marking our Philistines. They sometimes buried in chambers. We had a number of chambers across the cemetery, sometimes with 27 individuals in a single chamber. Other times you could see the effects of opening and closing a chamber. In this case, they ran out of space down here, so they had to move this block up there. As they were reopening and opening the chamber. And when we look at the parallels again for the construction of these chambers, I have here a parallel with a chamber from Lebanon, because even the way they're putting the stones in, even their architectural patterns are now mirroring general Eastern Mediterranean patterns that are not distinct in any particular way. Maybe that's a pattern that I'm seeing, a repeated idea. We see it in language, we see it in their pottery, we see it in their architecture, and all those kinds of things. Okay, so with this cemetery in place, immediately when we started to excavate the cemetery, we were thinking about how we were going to use this to understand who the Philistines are. And we remembered that there were some other much smaller collections that we had of other individuals who had lived at Ashkelon. We had 3 collections. The first collection on the left-hand side, this collection, was of people from the Bronze Age. So from the 15th or the 14th century. And then we had people from the 12th and 11th century, which we were talking about before, the early Philistines. And then we had our Philistine cemetery. we decided to look at all of these together as sort of a single research project to try to track the population of Ashkelon and see what the changes were through time when it came to what their DNA looked like. And so working with the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Human History, the Science of Human History, we started to put together this program, and first we started to look at trying to understand the Canaanites who would have preceded the Philistines. And so we were able to get DNA from several individuals here, also radiocarbon dates that made it clear that we were dealing with earlier individuals before the coming of the Philistines, and we had good results. In order to understand those results, though, I have to just take a slight break and say that whenever we're dealing with ancient DNA, we're always trying to do it in terms of ancestral populations. Just like I am the product of two people, so these populations are always the product of earlier, more distant ancestral populations. And so in this particular case, when we're looking at Europe and the Near East, we're looking at these Western European hunter-gatherers, we're looking at Levantine farmers and Iranian farmers, all of whom are much earlier populations who were distinct and separate for some time, and allow us then to look at the groups that might be somehow connected to any one of them and look at them in terms of proportions. So when we looked at our Canaanites, it was pretty clear. What we had was individuals who had none of this material from farther to the west, and were really just a combination of things that you would generally find in the Near East. These are the local people. And in fact, they're the local people at Ashkelon, they're the local people at Sidon and Megiddo, and more or less this is the pattern that you get from the Bronze Age on basically anywhere you're digging in the Near East, even until today. So we had the locals. We were able to see what they looked like. Then we moved from there into the center of the city and started to look at the 12th century. And there we had material that came very clearly from after the time of Ramses III. We had a scarab of Ramses III. And then we had these individuals, these children, who were buried underneath the floor of houses. And so as we started to investigate them, we had to go back and sort of understand these ancestral populations. Now I'm going to add one more thing about sort of what you're going to see in terms of the result. And that is, here are modern European populations, and you'll notice that they're not at all like this earlier Stone Age population. And the reason they're not similar to the Stone Age population, they're shifted across our graph, is because at least twice since that Stone Age era, but until the modern era, there have been major migrations into Europe. The first one was when the agriculture was invented, and you had this group of people, these Levantine farmers, who were going up into Europe and bringing with them their genetic material. And the second one, here with these Iranian farmers, people coming over probably through Ukraine and that general area, maybe the people responsible for bringing Indo-European languages, but they also brought with them their DNA and brought it into Europe. So it shifted the sort of European genome away from that original Stone Age population. So when we take that idea and look at what's happened here with our Ashkelon material, look at how we have all three of these things. All three of these groups together, just like you would have in specific European populations. We have both the European, Western European hunter-gatherer DNA and the Levantine and the Iranian all together. And this is what it would look like if you were in different parts of Europe with that combination, just like we see here. Sometimes people will say, well, oh, you only have 14% of your DNA is European. Like, no, you don't understand what European means in terms of putting this together, because really it's the combination of all of these ancestral populations as it would be understood in Europe. This is an easy graph just so you can get a sense for what's going on. As we do more advanced statistical tests, it becomes a little bit more detailed in terms of what's going on. And the closest match for trying to understand this, and I think still the most plausible match for understanding where this group came from, is Crete. It doesn't look like it's farther to the north. There are other matches that extend farther to the west, Sardinia, even Spain. But again, this looks to be the most interesting match. And here what we have for the first time is direct evidence of a migration. You can't fake your DNA, right? We're not talking about just moving styles or moving ideas. We're talking about moving people. And so what we have is an example of a migration of a group of people in this time of the 12th and 11th century. This place they're coming from has an ancient name in the 2nd millennium B.C. It's called Keftiu. We know this because it's found on Egyptian wall paintings. And even we have some Egyptian itinerary lists. And Eric Klein and Shelley Waxman have done a lot of work to try to nail this down. And I think they're right in identifying Keftiu with Crete in the ancient world. It's kind of an archaic name. It's lost after the second millennium for the most part. But it seems to be a name that we have that's been identified that would be a good location for our Philistines to have come from, or our Ashkelon people to have come from. I've also put Kaftor here, which I think is a first millennium rendering of that name, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But okay, what about our Philistine cemetery? Right? Because our Philistine cemetery was our third group of people, and when we looked at the Philistine cemetery, we had a result that, I don't know whether it was surprising or not, but it was interesting. Here's our Philistine result from the cemetery. You'll notice that in the 12th and 11th century, we had that signal that was clear from the west. Notice that it's more or less gone away. We have a situation by the 10th and the 9th century where the genetic distinctiveness of this group of people is no longer apparent in their genome. When we look at why that was or how that came about, and we look at it in a little more detail, we can see that it's very possible, very likely, that what we're looking at is the original people here who still lived around the same area, plus this new group of immigrants coming in could have produced this group down here. It's just that the immigrant group was small and didn't refresh itself in any way. So over time, as they married out, it looks like they lost any kind of genetic distinctiveness. Now, this reminds us of a number of stories in the biblical text where we have not antagonism between the Philistines and the people around them, but actually descriptions of social engagement. Men and women from each side being joined to one another in marriages that are even sanctioned by the community. There doesn't seem to be a lot of resistance, or certainly not enough resistance, to outmarriage by these groups. It seems to have happened. They seem to have thought it was sort of part of the things that went on in this region. Okay, so who are the Philistines in this story? Because at one level, we saw initially that the Philistines were distinct, genetically, linguistically, culturally. Now, all of a sudden, by the time we get to the 10th and the 9th century, and certainly by the 8th and the 7th century, they're not distinct culturally, they're not distinct linguistically, and they're not distinct genetically. Who are these people? Is there any thread that ties them together and helps us to understand how this group works? I think there is. This study, looking at the DNA, forced me to go back and look at some interesting passages. And you don't have to read this whole passage here. This is a passage from the Hebrew Bible from Jeremiah 47. One of the things that the prophets like to do in that era is they like to condemn other countries. And when they condemn other countries, they like to condemn them in ways that are appropriate. So if they're condemning Moab, they'll talk about the canyon in Moab where people are yelling across saying, Moab is fallen. If they're talking about Edom, they'll talk about the people hiding in the crags and the rocks because Edom is rocky. If they talk about Tyre, they'll make Tyre into this great economic powerhouse of a ship that sinks. They always do things that are trying to be appropriate for the kind of condemnation that they're giving. And so they're writing about their time, not about an earlier time. They're not making a historical claim. They're writing about the world as they see it right now. And so here this is Jeremiah writing about the world that he sees in his day in the 7th and 6th century. And he says in the 7th and 6th century, when I look at the Philistines, right, the thing that's distinctive about them is, as you see in the middle, the Philistines, the remnant from the island of Kaftor. Now for me, this is amazing, because what this shows us is that somebody remembers. Despite all the changes in culture, despite the changes in language and all these different things, someone remembers the story. Someone remembers that that's where we came from. And so in the earlier period, we have the Peliset, we have immigrants from the island of Keftiu, and in this later text, we have the Philistines, remnant from the island of Kaftor. Over 600 years, or almost 600 years, they're able to remember a founding story that defines them. And here, for the first time, we can draw that string and make it tight from the beginning, where we can see that they came from Keftiu through their DNA, all the way to the end where we can see that's the claim that they were making in the 7th and the 6th century. Here's a group of people that defined themselves based on their origin story. That's not unusual. We all do the same thing. We often celebrate July 4th, even though most of us weren't here when that would have originally happened. Like, we adopt an origin story. We make a claim about ourselves. And it seems from the evidence that we now have, the Philistines did that themselves. And they had a claim about who they were, a claim that no doubt they were proud of because they remembered it for century after century. Who are we? We are the remnant from the island of Kaftor. We are the Philistines. Thank you.
I thank you so much for this audience probably knows that at a certain point I sort of send a signal, I think you better wrap up. I did not tonight. I cannot think of a greater compliment. We are going to take some questions, and I want to ask the first one, if I may. Seeing your images, and it's about writing. Crete, I think of linear A, linear B. I think of Pylos, and we had a program about Pylos many years ago. And Pylos and writing as well. Is there any connection between this or not?
I showed you the texts that we have.
Yes.
They're pitiful.
Yes, they are.
And they're very hard to decipher. So it's controversial to make any statement about them. And Frank Morcross, who is one of the great paleographers who's ever been, connected them to the Cypro-Minoan script. So a script that's on Cyprus. But that's not certain. And with that seal, Kyle McCarter connected it also perhaps to the Cypro-Minoan script, but he was extremely cautious. So what we're dealing with is this evidence that they're doing something different. But what it is and what particularly it is or what the language is or any of those things are entirely beyond us at this point.
You know, we had a program, must have been around 12 years ago, with Celia Bergoffen, who spoke about some of the little juglets. I was thinking of her program when you were showing the images, and these were juglets made in Cyprus, found in Israel. So you have a very strong connection. This was amazing. In any case, I thank you, Daniel, for a brilliant talk. Enjoy the punch served beyond.